All right, people. All right. Inna alhamdulillah wa kafah. والصلاة والسلام على رسوله المصطفى وعلى عباده الذين ارتضى ومن بهداهم اهتدى وبآثار أهل المدينة اقتفى وبعد فالسلام الله على القوم أهلا وسهلا بكم ومرحبا. People, I'm just going to do a audio sound check, make sure you can all hear me. Let me just check with mi gente on Facebook and YouTube. Right, I've just brought up the YouTube comments. Facebook people, all right. Claire, you're doing it. Ash, all right. I take it the sound is coming through fine. Just give me a quick bounce back confirmation. All right. So people, yep. Claire, you're doing it. Shukran, shukran. All right, and shukran Hassam, much appreciated, and Azarati. All right, people, all right. So, let me just bring up before you a profile of our guest tonight. You can see right here coming up before you the esteemed guest. Right, that people, ladies and gentlemen, damas y caballeros, as you're seeing right there. No, it's not a younger version of Liam Neeson, which you're probably imagining. It is a much greater personality I present to you people. The man, the myth, this is Dr. Professor Adis, I'm going to get the surname wrong, Duderija, all the way from Griffith University, Australia. Let's welcome our Professor and Ustad. Assalamu alaikum, Professor Adis.
Wa alaikum salam, the Mufti.
Shukran, ahlan wa sahlan for joining us today and taking out your time.
Shukriya for having me. I'm really excited to be with you.
Wallahi, it's an absolute pleasure. People, a brief, just a backdrop to the professor we have today, who hails from Bosnia, born and raised, and then has traveled across the globe, has a deep commitment and passion for the Deen of Islam, has engaged in higher education and further studies through a master's right into a PhD, focusing on aspects such as, a huge range from makassid of Sharia to feminist theology within Islam to the radical narrative of Salafism and how that presents certain dangers or challenges to Muslims, and has authored over 6 books and several other editorial pieces. The man, the myth, people. So, ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban marratan ukhra, Sheikh.
Shukriya. Thank you for having me. As I said, I'm very honored to be sharing this platform with you, Mufti, because I am very much in awe of your amazing erudition and your moral courage, and you represent the best of what our classical Islamic heritage can offer us today. And as I said, I'm so delighted to be in your company.
Wow. Now, as people are going to say, I've obviously paid the professor to say that.
Not at all. Those of you who know me know that I have endorsed you publicly on previous occasions, and as I said, I am very much in awe of your reasoning, your intellect, your vast erudition, your moral courage to stand up and call a spade, and to essentially allow us to view Islam through a different lens, based on reason, based on intellect, based on beauty and justice.
Wow.
So
I appreciate that, Professor. Shukran. And it really, wallahi, it means a lot to me, because obviously they're amazing words, and I'm sure that they're incredibly, they're just gratifying and just hearing them. But it actually means a lot in the sense that I naturally, as I say that, I face at times a lot of heat, a lot of hate for the stuff I say, and even though there's a lot of love out there, but every time somebody reiterate, especially in your standing, Professor, it means a lot to me. So shukran, hayyak Allah. May Allah keep you smiling for these kind words, Professor. Your journey, right? Share. You've been through an incredible, profound academic, a path really that has spanned many years in your life. Uh, first of all, Islam. I mean, you're in Australia, pursuing an academic path in Islam. How did you come about that? I mean, because that doesn't have much of a great career prospect, does it, for many people? They would assume not.
Thank you for that question. It's an interesting question. So I actually initially trained as a primary school teacher, but I've had an interest in academic discussions on Islam from my early undergraduate days. So harking back to mid to late 1990s. At that time, there were very limited opportunities. I grew up in Bosnia and moved with my family to Australia when I was 19, in the aftermath of the Bosnian War and conflict. As an undergraduate student, I became involved in the Muslim Student Association at my university, and was increasingly interested in my faith. And started to explore different approaches to, this is mid to late, kind of 1996, 97, 98. The internet was very much in its infancy. I came across the website Understanding Islam that was administered by a group of students of Sahib Ghamidi.
Okay.
Wow. And I also, through my university, I was reading academic works on Islam. Primarily, I started off with Professor Fazl Rahman, who originally is from Pakistan, of course, but ended up being a professor at University of Chicago. I read a lot of his works, especially on the concept of Sunnah and Hadith. And of course, Ghamidi Sahib's work on Sunnah awakened my interest in this topic, and I never really looked back. I understood the centrality of the concept and how different interpretations of Islam often were a product of and the derivative of these different understandings and approaches to this concept of Sunnah, putting, of course, the Quran aside. So I was, and then when 9/11 happened, I was then increasingly asking myself as to why do we have so many different interpretations of Islam? Where do they come from? Why is it that my Islam of my childhood was so friendly, so open-minded, so cosmopolitan? Why is there a different kind of Islam in different places? Which led me eventually to do my honors thesis on what I call neo-traditional Salafi concept or approach to Sunnah and Hadith. Mm-hmm. And from there, I did my PhD on comparing two contemporary Islamic movements, the Salafis and the Progressives. What are the interpretational assumptions that underpin their approaches to Quran and Sunnah? And how do they play themselves out in relation to this concept of what it means to be a religiously ideal Muslim woman?
Wow. Okay. And what did you? And what are some key features and aspects that kind of, that raise their heads in this? You've got these two polarized views. Almost, you said progressive people, and you've got like Salafi people, these true traditions. What were some key features you discovered in this?
All right. So when it comes to the interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah,
Yeah.
one of the major differences is at the level of contextualization. And so the progressives are contextualizing the Quran much more because they recognize that the very nature of the language of the Quran and its ontological status require contextualization. That even at the level of its grammar and the usage of words,
Yeah.
we see that the context shaped the content of the Quran quite significantly. That is not to say that the Quran doesn't have ontologically divine status, however, that it was very much a product of a particular context, and that text and context are but two sides of the same coin. So there's an emphasis on contextualizing, especially the ethical legal elements in the Quran. That are reflected in its language.
Because I always find a confusion, Professor, with or a misleading or a easily misconstrued statement, which everybody agrees on, is that Islam or the Quran is for all times. And even though this statement, this maxim, everybody agrees on it, they radically disagree on what that actually means, because to some people it means that it will reflect each time, and to other people it means no, the time it came in must be superimposed on each time. Like, so when there's
that's an excellent point. Obviously, the progressives would very much argue in the favor of, once we interpret the Quran contextually and once and holistically, we can deduce a particular worldview, a particular Quranic ethic, and that is what remains central in the core of the Quran. But there are many, let's say, historical or accidental elements to the Quran that need to be seen in the broader context in which the Quran was revealed. And we need to, and then we go down the path of what you have also often stated, the teleological moral trajectory, that kind of argument. That we need to look at the significance of meaning rather than just the surface literal meaning, and we need to extrapolate certain values and principles that are ethically rationalist in nature, that do not require textualist substrate, and these are the kulliyat, these are the principles that remain, whereas the rest needs to be seen from a contextualist lens.
You see, what people say to that, Doc, what they say to it is that, you see, so what you're stating, in other words, is that you see, there was a morality or a perception of a morality that existed 1400 years ago, and morality has kind of had some evolutionary process along the way. Did God not know that so as to not highlight it in the Quran? This is obviously an immediate knee-jerk comeback that is presented. What are your thoughts to that? Yeah.
There are a couple of, we can look at that argument or respond to that argument from two perspectives. One is what I call intra-Quranic, and we saw, okay, we look at the Quran and the nature of Quranic language, and how does the Quran go about, let's say, does the Quran give us any definitions of moral concepts? Quran uses moral language, definitely, refers to moral and ethical concepts, but the Quran never defines these concepts, does it? So what does that imply? The Quran, that implies, so like the words such as ihsan, ma'aruf, adl, all of these terminologies present in the Quran, but the Quran does not define these concepts, which means that the Quran must imply that these concepts are rationalist in nature, and they can be understood without the aid of revelation.
Yeah.
And to some, therefore, we do not need revelation to tell us what is morally right and wrong. The nature of a revelation is to aid us.
Yeah, and what supports that straight away, Professor, is you see clear verses of the Quran that Allah simply states as a maxim. He states that, look, يُحِلُّ لَكُمُ الطَّيِّبَاتِ يُحَرِّمُ عَلَيْكُمُ الْخَبَائِثِ. He makes bad things, or let's say things which are whether you want to say filthy or wrong, he makes them haram, and he makes good things halal for you. Now, this verse doesn't highlight what is good or what is bad. There's an assumption that you already have an understanding as human beings of what is good and what is bad.
Yeah, I mean, the progressives, when it comes to the concept of revelation itself, it's not purely textual, okay? Yeah. The concept of revelation is much broader in progressive Muslims' thought. So the pretext or reason is actually constitutive of revelation as well as nature itself. Yeah. So progressives have a much broader concept of what constitutes a revelation. So the Quran is one dimension or one aspect of revelation. And Professor Shadab Ahmed, who has written a wonderful book called What is Islam? On the importance of being Islamic.
Shahab Ahmed, yes, I do have
it. And he talks about how actually what's happened over the last 100 years or so, this very concept of what constitutes revelation and its sources has shrunk to a primarily textualist hermeneutic, whereas in the past, what he calls the Bengal to Balkan complex, which he means the kind of intellectual paradigm, the predominant intellectual paradigm that was prevalent in the Muslim world from the Balkans to the Bengal, actually had a much broader understanding of the concept of revelation and its scope. So therefore, we consider that revelation in the form of the Quran is but one source of overall guidance of God.
Yeah, you know,
an important one, but nonetheless not the only one.
Of course, and you know, just a point that I'd just like to pick your brains on, Professor. That you know. Progressive Islam. I personally don't use that term generally, and I don't identify personally as a progressive Muslim, even though I'm sure I'm perceived as that by many. And I kind of argue that, you see, this way of thinking that I'm saying about makassid and saying that you should go with ease and you should go with this is actually, I would argue, in the Sunnah and in the original sources. I'm not coming up with it now. Do you feel, but I understand when people use it today to kind of they differentiate between Salafis but do you not feel that these terms, you see, the problem is, don't you feel it then hijacks the cause of this kind of of this trajectory? Because people say, well, oh, that's just a modernist Islam, you know, it's not the traditional Islam. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, at one level, labels are inevitable, especially like in academic discourses. When I was conceptualizing what I consider to be progressive Islam, I had to situate it in relation to other scholarly works that have similar ideas or similar approaches. So I was like grafting it on an existing approach that used the word progressive. Yeah. So, but if you look at, for example, my last book on progressive Islam, The Imperatives of Progressive Islam, there are like 8 constituting elements of it, and none of them use the word progressive in that, you know, it's not it's just a shortcut.
Of course, of course.
You know, sometimes we need to
Yeah.
take shortcuts, and we don't have the luxury of explaining
Yeah.
like an
And
entire
I would also
religious
feel,
philosophy.
Professor, it depends
Mhm.
on the audience as well, al-mukhatab, isn't it? That who you're addressing, because if in an academic arena, or in the field of academia, I feel you would have to use these words because that's what the academic textbooks understand, and that is their frames of reference. Whereas I suppose I'm generally just more addressing the kind of common Muslim out there who, to them, this word might seem a bit like, oh my God, that's, people taunt Muslims with these words but in your field, obviously, as a lecturer, as a senior lecturer, I mean, it's only right that you use these words so the audience, the students know exactly what you're referring to.
Exactly, and there is a number of other terms that could be used to substitute the word progressive. It could be cosmopolitan, it could be contextualist, it could be rationalist.
I like it. How you doing it, Professor? Cosmopolitan Muslims. That's really I was gonna ask
but hopefully we can go beyond the semantics today and really dig deeper.
Of course, and the only reason I mentioned that, Professor, is I could see some people were questioning, progressive, and I just wanted to kind of get that out the way to say, well, that's not, you're using it because in your field that's how you have to address these terms, in academia. But coming to the core, unpacking the actual, trying to get to the actual kernel of it. So this whole search for things like meaning, makassid, for objectives of Sharia, do you feel there is a greater need for this in this day and age to start off with? Because somebody could say, well, if I go back 800 years, yes, there were makassid, but people weren't obsessed. I mean, what's all this obsession with makassid?
Yes, of course, every concept is a product of a particular contextual positioning of the people who are kind of utilizing and employing it. So there are a number of reasons as to why we've had the revival of the makassid discourse in this day and age. It's interesting. There is a couple of fascinating books on this as to why, for example, and in many ways, makassid discourse over the last 10, 15 years, the revival of the makassid discourse was a direct response to the ever-growing presence of the Salafi discourse. Yeah. So it was kind of a corrective to what became a more dominant discourse. So, and it, of course, every concept that is trying to be revived, that is being revived, has an antecedent in Islamic intellectual history. So we have the Shatibis and the Al-Ghazalis who have talked about all of these concepts. But the way progressives use the concept of makassid is different from, let's say, the way even Salafis use the concept of makassid and the so-called taqleed-based approaches to Islam, the mainstream Sunni, if you like. All of them use the concept of makassid, but the underpinning usuli paradigm within which makassid is positioned in a hierarchical sense is very different. So progressives have a contextualist approach to makassid.
And
traditionalists have,
just for a second, just as an interjection to clarify for the audience who are unfamiliar with the term makassid we're using time and time again. Maqasid is referring to the objectives of the Sharia, that the Sharia is operating to serve these objectives. And the purpose of that is that if the Sharia is not obtaining those objectives, it would then adapt in order to obtain them. You understand? So if it is trying to seek welfare for people, if that particular ruling was no longer bringing welfare, the Sharia ought to adapt to make sure the welfare maqsad, the goal, the objective is being met. Yeah.
That's right. It's a kind of it's premised upon this idea that there is an underlying philosophy behind Islamic law and ethics.
Yeah.
It's not just for the sake of
rituals.
Not only that, but so Islamic law is not just for the sake of coming up with with ahkam, regardless of context and regardless of what's, it's premised upon this idea that
it has a purpose.
Islamic law has a purpose. Yes,
Purposive.
It has an objective. So exactly. So now, of course, as I said, you could have at least 3 different pathways or conceptualizations of the makassid. As I said, it can operate within a very decontextualist paradigm that emphasizes the noose, the Quran and the Hadith, and situates the makassid as the makassid play only a secondary role, in a sense that they are subservient to a textualist hermeneutic of the Quran and the Hadith. So, and that's the Salafi approach. They say, well, makassid must always be derived from a textualist hermeneutic. It must always be linked to a particular dalil that is in the noose. Whereas the taqlidi, the mainstream Sunni Islam, because they have more scope for maneuvering in terms of the usul al-fiqh paradigm by allowing qiyas and ijma', then that opens up more space for the maqasid. But however, the overall Quran Sunnah hermeneutic is still, I would say, semi-contextualist at best. And as Professor Hashim Kamali has argued for a very long time, mainstream Sunni Islam has placed the maqasid in a secondary role, in a subservient role. So even though they agree with the idea that there are certain maqasid, they can never overrule a particular interpretation of the Quran that is based on a semi-textualist or textualist interpretation.
An analogy or an allegory that I give at times, Professor, is like, and this may help some of the viewers understand it better, is that imagine there's a product which is the Sharia, which is the rules within Islam. Let's say it's, I don't know, it's a piece of, it could be a vehicle, or it's something that is there, that has been created, that has been made. Now, we all understand that it was done using tools, that there was a toolbox that had tools to make this particular product. This much everybody agrees on. And so they all agree that there were tools, that these things, that there was a purpose, and there were tools that made this in that way. What they disagree on is when we inherited this product, whatever it is, did we also inherit the toolbox? Or is it just the knowledge that, yes, there was a toolbox made to use this, we accept that, but we don't have a toolbox to adjust it any further? Or do we have the toolbox so we too can tweak it with the day and age? This is where the madhabs kind of fell apart and disagreed, and even individual scholars disagreed over time.
That's a good analogy, I think. But the most crucial element here is also the differences is the maqasid theories also are directly linked to this idea whether or not ethics is objective and is it dependent upon text or not. So if we say that the maqasid are basically rationalist in nature, they can evolve over time, and what was just in one context might not necessarily be just in another context. So a contextualist approach allows for these concepts to be epistemologically updated and to be contextually driven, whereas mainstream Sunni and the Salafi approaches are premised on a completely different worldview that locates authenticity and perfection in the past and their theory of ethics is completely textualist based.
A bit of the divine commandment theory, Professor.
Exactly.
So basically,
Exactly.
Socrates had this understanding, people, that look, did God command X because X is good, or is X good because God simply commanded it? So this is the divine commandment theory that, is God telling us to do things which are already good? Or is it that God just came up with a list of things, and because he came up with the list, they are now what we call good? That's the...
Exactly, yeah. So, and I think a holistic approach to the Quran and the way the Quran uses ethical and moral concepts suggests that they are ethically objectivist in nature, meaning they are independent of texts. I mean, there is a wonderful book written in early 20th century by an Egyptian scholar, Mohammed Daraz.
Oh, yes.
The Moral View of the Quran. It's a 600-page volume. It was originally written in French and was translated into English. It's a most comprehensive and most authoritative...
Is this the same Daraz who worked on the Muwafaqat of Shatibi?
I think so, yes. I don't quote me on that.
Because there is one of the... Because the Muwafaqat that was edited and brought into, mass published was by a Daraz as well, Egyptian from the 20th century. Okay.
Yes, it's most likely him. I mean, it would make sense because he was probably interested in the Muwafaqat, excuse me, because of the fact that, it's one of the major scholarly works on the concept of maslaha as a kind of major interpretative tool through which to evaluating the Islamic legal philosophy. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the same Daraz. But he in that work, which is, as I said, by far the most comprehensive examination of the moral language of the Quran, he is very much on the side of the idea that ethical moral concepts in the Quran assumes that they are objectivist in nature.
My just to just put this out there, I don't know what your thoughts are on it, Doc. See, my take on this has been very similar to the kind of psychological analysis of language, that I feel that there is a morality instinct that is there, that we have it already, just the way we have a language instinct. If you want to call it an instinct like Steve Pinker, or whether you want to call it a kind of modality, whatever you want to use, but that there's this kind of raw base which exists, like how Noam Chomsky says with language, a universal grammar, this kind of wiring exists. And then we get influenced by our kind of zeitgeist, by our day and age, by things to really pack it up. So I feel that for morality at a base level of avoiding harm, recognizing harm, and then empathy, with the quality, with the aspect of empathy, not wanting that or wanting to avoid that, these kind of core things serve the base, and then we add on it based on our society. So I don't feel it's like something we entirely just purely philosophical, like we sat down and thought, well, chopping off or blinding someone, I think that's bad philosophically. I think we recognize harm. Like when we see it, we understand suffering, and we then don't want it, and then we add on this from a social perspective. That's been my take. I don't know what you feel about that.
Yeah. I mean, that's perhaps a separate question, and I do, but what I'm interested here in ascertaining is if we take the Quran as a whole,
of course,
as a unified whole, and we want to analyze the way it employs and uses moral language and moral terms, I think we cannot come to any different conclusion but to say that Quran assumes that there is this inherent moral compass that exists in humanity, and that it addresses that moral compass. and
The kind of
yeah,
fitra.
if
Yes.
you like, if you like, and uh, and that is very, very important in terms of trying to develop an interpretative model of the Quran and overall in terms of its overall Islamic legal philosophy as such, Islamic legal theory. We need to know what is this relationship between reason and revelation and ethics, because that will have a flow-on effect in terms of how we do Islamic jurisprudence and how we do Islamic ethics.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I'm not sure if
No, no,
that's
no. That's
clear.
very. That's amazing, and part of this, right? You see part of the things that have developed throughout the age, throughout the centuries and over a millennium, is not obviously there's understandings of social aspects of philosophies, but a key aspect, especially in the modern day and age, is of feminism and this whole thing of women's centricity in a dialogue or in the dialogue, so to speak. Now, or في الخطاب القرآني or في الخطاب الديني in the wider address, and this is something you've written expansively about as well. So, yeah, tell us about this, Professor.
All right. So what I've tried to do, some of the things that I've tried to do is, I think, to deconstruct how the concepts of femininity and masculinity that we find in the Islamic interpretative tradition, and how these concepts infiltrate and taint the interpretations of the Quran, and how they also are dealt with in the Hadith literature. So let me say a bit more. When we look at Muslim family laws, we see that they are, and the entire Muslim Islamic cosmology, looking at it from a classical paradigm, is very gendered. Many aspects of Islamic law, for example, are gendered. Even rituals are gendered. And often, if we dig very deeply and we try to understand what are the ultimate reasons behind investing so heavily in a gendered approach to Islamic law and ethics, we see that what hides underneath are certain ideas pertaining to the nature of masculinity and femininity, especially in general and especially in relation to the nature of male and female sexuality. So there are a cluster of concepts that have been used to construct what is masculinity and what is normative masculinity and normative femininity in classical Islamic tradition. When we look at the concept of masculinity, for example, it's associated conceptually. There are certain conceptual markers of masculinity and femininity. When it comes to masculinity, we find these ideas of masculinities conceptually associated with things such as religious authority, political authority, even some level, even aspects of superiority, ontological superiority. So we have ideas, using particular Quranic verses or Hadith, primarily Hadith, saying that God prefers men over women.
Just as a slight interjection here, just for the viewers, we're not saying that's correct. We're just saying this is the perception. This is how it's projected.
That's the predominant discourse in the Islamic interpretative tradition. In the Islamic interpretative tradition, and Islamic interpretative tradition includes here tafsir, fiqh, and akhlaq. Okay, so in all of these genres, we find these ideas that masculinity is associated with religious authority, political and public authority, and even this idea, in some cases, that there is an inherent preference for men over women on behalf of God. and also a particular approach to male sexuality as something that, like the idea of what I would call very ugly concept of male sexual jealousy, that is completely out of proportion.
That a person could,
and
he could kill his wife if he's seen her doing this, and he's almost justified in his, in this kind of ghira, ghira that he has.
Ghira, the concept of patriarchal honor resides in, and this was what I was going to mention in relation to the concept of femininity. So the concept of femininity is exactly the opposite of masculinity, in a sense that femininity is constructed like it's constructed in relation to the concepts of absence or lack of religious authority, lack of political and public authority, and in relation to the female sexuality, the concepts of fitna and aura as kind of aggressive sexuality that can erode the societal fabric of Muslim society, that is extremely dangerous to the civilizational health of Muslim society.
But it's sadly true. It's sadly true. That's the portrayal.
So once you invest in these ideas of what masculinity and femininity is, you use them to interpret certain Quranic verses and to give kind of to give these concepts that we find in the Quran are very much a patriarchal and androcentric.
An example that's just coming straight to mind is, like, for example, having sex with the slaves, or even marrying of other faiths. But the slave one came straight to mind, that it's, even though the Quranic discourse was generic, but the understanding after the Prophet's lifetime, when it emerges in the time of the Khulafa, was that, wait a minute, this is this is humiliating, that a slave is having then sex with this Muslim woman, women, and obviously these concepts are being challenged, like, because they're struggling with that. Shouldn't be, because they're thinking, no, that's that's not right. It's not justified.
So what we do in a progressive or contextual Islam, if you like, one of the elements of its hermeneutic is this idea that to call something truly Quranic, a Quranic value, it needs to be initiated by the Quran and not reflected in the Quran.
Wow.
All right.
Okay, that's interesting.
So the Quran, all the societal practices that the Quran confronted at that time, the Quran didn't really initiate them. It confronted them and tried to mitigate them. So therefore, what is normative here is the element of mitigation and not the actual prescription as such. So because there is, we also make a distinction between meaning and its significance. The meaning can still be the same, but its significance could be different. And then if we look at the Quranic verse, الرِّجَالُ قَوَّامُونَ عَلَى نِسَاءٍ, we could still say that in that context, the idea of men being qawamun made sense. But in a different context, that meaning could have a different significance. If, let's say, if the societal norms change, that Quranic concept, that Quranic verse would no longer have any significance, because it only had significance in a particular context that was appropriate to that context.
In the sense that, were these things what you call bil asl or bil wasf, or in other terms, are they situational or dispositional? Like, is this a key disposition? That it is true that in Arabia that the men had, so for example, this debate occurs in the Hanafi usul, in the time of Imam Abu Hanifa, where they're saying, well, women don't need a man to authorize them to get married. They can marry themselves off. And other scholars are challenging them, and they say, well, Allah says in the Quran, la ta'duluhunna, don't prevent them from getting married. Now, the Hanafi reaction to that was that, yes, it was stating that as a description of what the society was doing, that this was the kind of situational factor. It's not that men had the dispositional right to prevent women. So this, it's a fascinating point. Yeah.
Yes, but it is interesting. It is interesting. I mean, we do need to pay careful attention to the Quranic grammar there. You know, when the Quran talks, it does address those who have social and political capital, and who are the men. So it says, you know, it uses, you know, it's basically, it suggests that men do have that power, but they are not supposed to be abusing it. Yeah. So you know, you should, if you divorce your women, do it in such and such a manner. So it assumes that that men do have that power, but that they should be mindful of God, because there's a day of judgment. You should be mindful of what you do, but it does not radically challenge the idea that certain group of men had the social and political capital, because possibly it wants to bring them on its own side, to its, you know, it wants to win them over. Yeah. So that's why it is so important to understand that the nature of the Quranic language and how it's reflected in the actual grammatical constructs that it uses, because it tells us about the power relationships that existed at that point in time. Yeah. So you know, when you look at the divorce verses, it clearly talks about, it suggests, or it assumes that men have the power, and then should they divorce Muslim women? So that is very revealing from the perspective of contextualist approaches to Islam, that we need to take this language into account seriously, because it has hermeneutical implications. It has important interpretational implications.
Yeah, I see. I mean, and also things which are debated today, like things like inheritance, and even the aspect of people sometimes bring up as a debate the blood money, or this whole debate of the blood money for a woman, you know, if there's been accidental, or if there's been manslaughter, is, you know, scholars in the past, many had said just half of that of a man. And this is obviously today used to kind of deride and to kind of almost, you know, to take pokes at Islam in saying, look, Islam is very misogynistic. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, all of these ideas, as I said, because the interpreters and the people who were constructing Islamic knowledge and Islamic sciences, living in a patriarchal cultural setting, it has definitely tainted or reinforced certain ideas that they had, that were very much, at least androcentric, if not patriarchal, and they were definitely they were definitely bringing these ideas into the exegetical and, you know, into the interpretative frameworks. So it's very, very difficult to kind of have a completely objectivist approach to scriptural reasoning and interpretation, because we are all inevitably conditioned by our cultural upbringing, and many situational factors do affect the way we go about interpreting, and some of them are extremely subtle. And unless we have this clearly on our radar, we could bring many pre-existing ideas and read them into the scripture.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
They might not necessarily be there.
And I feel that, you see, Hadith, because I feel that Hadith were, obviously, one is using revelation scripture to kind of manipulate the meaning, or to kind of interpret it in a particular angle. But Hadith, on several occasions, obviously I'm not saying all Hadith, but there were certain Hadith that were fabricated or misrelayed to people over, you know, throughout time, where I feel people's biases have really not only come out but then influence people. Because you're saying, a moment ago, Professor, you said, well, like people's upbringing. But you see, when the upbringing reinforces a narrative, so if you take the hadith that speak of things like the youth, this person that the Prophet almost curses this person who is at the youth. And the definition of a the youth is the one who doesn't have this excessive jealousy over his women. Now, you see, now here, what you're doing is you're strong arming individuals into thinking they need to have that aggressive jealousy, otherwise they're lacking in faith. And yeah,
Definitely. Definitely. And Professor Khalid Abul Fadl has used the word authorial enterprise. When you look at the hadith,
wow.
Authorial enterprise, meaning that inevitably all the people who were involved in the isnad have there's an indelible mark of their own personality and biases imprinted in it, and in the way in which the narrative came out, the way it was structured, the way it was articulated. It was an enterprise of multiple authorship, if you like.
Definitely. I mean, I would definitely feel, because I would feel these kind of hadith to do with the youth and stuff like this are clearly fabricated, and they've been done. I'm not saying everybody who fabricated them or was part of that enterprise had a malicious intention. You see, sometimes some things just come together in a particular way that people reinforce their own cultural perspective, and they think that's what they heard, and they think, there's also false memories, there's things that happen. Because when you look at the hadith,
Sure.
it's fascinating. There's a hadith, and Ibn Rushd brings it in his discussion in Bidayat al-Mujtahid as well, that there was a companion who complains to the Prophet about his wife always being not just flirty with men, but the actual word he uses, la taruddu yada lamis, that, when men not only flirt with her, but they try to be intimate with her and touch her, she doesn't mind. And she kind of like goes with it and likes it. And the Prophet said, because in the discussion, and that Ibn Rushd brings, that the Prophet says, like he's obviously complaining, as in he's had enough of this relationship. So the Prophet says, well, okay, why don't you end the relationship? فَطَلِّقْهَا. And he says, لَكِنِّي أُحِبُّهَا. And the Prophet says, why don't you divorce her then? And he says, no, but I love her. And then the Prophet said, فَاصْبِرْ, then be patient. I mean, that. And there was no insult here in saying, oh my God, you're the youth, and how can your woman do this, and you still want to be with her, you lack faith. There wasn't this kind of a reaction. So yeah, but
that's spot on analysis. That's spot on. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do think that these conceptual markers of masculinity and femininity are ultimately responsible for a lot of kind of legal edicts and legal understandings that are doing a disservice to both men and women, and they really need to be conceptualized alternatively. We need to strengthen the conceptual relationship between, let's say, femininity and scholarly and religious knowledge. We need to strengthen the conceptual relationship between femininity and public authority. We need to move away from the idea of female sexuality being inherently corrupting morally. We need to move away from the idea of this aggressive sexuality that reduces men to beasts, sexual beasts, to really move away from these conceptualizations that basically characterize patriarchal societies, and that we find also, importantly, we find in other religious traditions and cultures.
I find sometimes this irony, Professor. I'm not sure if you covered it as part of the gender studies of feminism within Islam. That you see, there's almost it's almost a mirror, two polarized versions or lenses placed on the female entity in much of tradition, and that is, on one hand, they say no, it's the man who is, for example, like you mentioned, this sexual beast who, and therefore it's kind of justified in many ways. Well, it's his nature. It's the woman is by default modest, and she's like this, and she shouldn't really even, sex is almost like a passive thing for her. It's not even this, it's really procreation or just serving the husband, his needs. But then you have, on the other end, you have this same a parallel concept that no, this woman's sexuality, if unleashed, is so dangerous that it would not only destabilize societies. This is why Allah says, was zaniya to first, and before saying the zani, and this is exemplified in the story of Zulaykha and Yusuf. And, and this temptress has led many a saints, off the path, and she's robbed the iman of many. You get these two shockingly polarized views.
And yeah, Professor Fatima Mernissi, who died a few years ago, a Moroccan sociologist, she's done an amazing amount of academic work in this space. She has very much pointed to this paradoxical construct of female sexuality that is kind of schizophrenic, even in a sense that they are mutually exclusive, and they produce its impact can be very it has impacted the nature of Muslim cultures throughout Islamic history, because the religious ideal has always been a woman who is operating entirely in the private sphere, a woman who an invisible woman is the ideal woman, so to speak. That's always been kind of upheld as a religious ideal, and it can, in its most detrimental its most detrimental dimension, it can lead to honor-based violence. Because there is this conceptual linking between patriarchal honor. The honor of the male resides in the behavior of the female folk, women, wives, and female children. So, especially what could be construed, and everything ends up being construed as sexual flirtatious behavior. So whatever a woman does, it's construed as having some kind of a sexual connotation to it. Therefore, they have to be regulated. There needs to be gender segregation. Women's movement needs to be strictly regulated, and so on and so forth.
And you're right. And this is why it's almost like the pack that creates this code, which then the individual, in many ways, is kind of even forced to live by. So you get in these honor killings and these honor attacks where people themselves, because it would be their own daughters, their own sisters, and they may not even want to, but they feel they have to. They feel that I'm obligated to kind of now punish this person because that's what needs to be done. That's the code.
Yeah, that's the ada. That's the kind of the social pressure. The social pressure that is exerted on them tacitly. And one thing, what I think where traditional Islamic leadership has failed is lack of condemnation of these kinds of practices, and the underlying ultimate kind of the ultimately responsible ideas that are under the surface that kind of enable these practices to continue to exist in Muslim cultural contexts.
Why
you
do you
know.
think that? You see, why do you think that was the case, that
Yeah.
they failed in doing that? Like, because it's not that, you see, there have been many female popular or influential or significant
Mm,
personalities within Islam, starting from, whether it's the
mm,
mothers of prophets right down to the wives, or whether it's going to be the daughters, or just female figures within Islam. They have existed, many, countless. But
mm.
yet, why has the kind of scholarship just failed in kind of condemning harshly? Like, yes, they will say it's wrong, but you're right.
Mm,
They don't condemn. They don't kind of
mm.
stamp the point out. And what led to that?
Yeah, I think there are parallels here. There are parallels here with what you've talked about in terms of underage marriage. You know, there is this residual ideas. We even have the hadith of if someone finds their wife committing zina, and if the person kills both because of his short temper, then that person is given a lenient sentence. So it's
Yeah,
kind of
this kind of crime
you
of
know
passion
uh,
that they.
Carbon passion, yeah. And because the interpretative tradition has invested heavily in these ideas of what masculinity and femininity are about, it undervalues, at the end of the day, it undervalues the life of women
Yeah,
and
that,
girls.
that that is, unfortunately,
That's
tragically. I mean, it's very sad but true.
yeah. We have to. I mean, we have to call a spade, because the kind of the ultimate, the ideal Muslim is, I think, invariably a male, kind of a male, a male kind of a male figure, or who has a particular pious, let's say, particular particular approach, or particular, let's say, who has internalized a particular concept of piety, that essentially is patriarchal, heavily patriarchal. That construct is heavily patriarchal, and it's based upon, I'm not saying, all the men are irredeemably patriarchal, but they do not. The current discourses on these issues are still, there is this benevolent patriarchy, I think, is one way of putting it, where men think they always know best, what is best for their wives and their daughters, and that they think that they always act in their best interests, regardless of whether or not their ideas are actually helpful or not.
No, and just to reiterate that point,
Yeah.
that it's definitely, and I don't agree with and what you said. I 100% second that, and I've never said that all men, Muslim men, are like this, and I would condemn that statement, because Muslim men, I don't believe all Muslim men are like that at all. But I feel that you see, the Muslim voice boxes, because Muslims generally they don't actually speak for Islam. They don't actually. They kind of constitute the masses that's on the ground. But Islam is presented in writings, in speeches, in kind of like, you have these muhadarat lectures, in videos. That's how Islam is generally kind of repped. Its representation, and in those, whether it's circles or that platform, it is, unfortunately, for whatever reason, it is presented in this way, that it is presented, and people seem to get very insecure if you challenge certain narratives. They think, oh, is this an attack on traditional Islam? Like this whole thing you mentioned about underage marriages, and I've been banging on about it for so long, that, look, listen, people need to be very, very clear. They need to be very kind of just have one voice on this matter. But the reason they don't is because they will say, you see, they will try and justify it by saying, oh, but there's this hadith, of Aisha's age. But that's one side. But the irony is, you see, this is what I find so ironic, that then you look at many of the fatwa according to several ulama, like let's say the Hanbali madhab or even other madhabs, scholars of they then set the bar according to that hadith. Like they say, okay, the age 9 is the age that we can do this. How do we know this? Because of this hadith. Why don't we pick on this? Why don't we pick on this hadith? Oh no, because the hadith is done by this ruling, but this ruling is based on this hadith. And it's like a self-serving kind of mechanism. And yeah,
yeah. Having said that, I mean, there are hadiths that are more gender egalitarian in nature. Men and women are each other's friends, or
so at the end of the day, what is it? An-Nisa, the famous one, that shaqa'iqur rijal, they're counter equal.
Yeah.
I wonder whether you also covered prophethood as an angle in that, because there was a huge debate: can women become prophets?
Not so far. No, I haven't gone down that path. But I certainly would not have any objections to the idea of female prophethood. And I would consider it legitimate. I mean, some people consider that the figure of Maryam in the Quran, obviously because
as a prophet,
I
myself too, I've said that I do believe Maryam alayhi salam was a prophet from God.
I guess because of the strongly patriarchal nature of the societies in which the prophets operated, so to speak, was not conducive, if you like, to a female prophethood. But I think, I don't see any particular reason why women would not be capable of prophethood.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, that's so. Yeah, I mean, and I feel sometimes what's happened is because, you see, if we don't own the discourse and we don't start to kind of challenge and hopefully change certain perspectives, what happens is I fear that there are, that it would then be usurped, the narrative would be kind of hijacked by people who would then just do more harm to Islam and the greater Muslim communities, even whether that's people who don't like Islam or whether it's Islam critics, or even sometimes I feel that there are certain very whether you want to say ultra feminist movements or things that will hate on whether it's going to be hate on men or hate on things, and they will use these things from Islam to say, well, look, Islam hates on women because blah 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 blah, and these things will show. And because Muslim scholars, men, are not challenging it, well, it shows that, well, you're content with it then. You're complicit with it because you're not really challenging the problems.
Yeah, and often these ideas about gender issues in Islam come from the Hadith literature, and over time Hadith became seen as the only repository or vehicle of perpetuating Sunnah, and therefore it's given a normative kind of normative standing. Whereas, given some of the stuff that I have done over the last decade or so, we see. I've come to the conclusion that the mainstream Sunni, what we consider the mainstream Sunni approach to Sunnah and Hadith, has actually quite substantially departed from the way the concept of Sunnah was understood during the formative period of Islam. And I'm happy to talk to you a little bit about that. And I know you have. I know you have on several occasions raise this issue, and I'm so happy that you are one of the very few people who is actually very much conscious and, you know, kind of insisting upon this distinction between early concept of Sunnah and how it evolved and became embodied in Hadith much later on.
Yeah, please do. Yeah,
but
please
if we look at
share your thoughts on that, because I've always highlighted that. Look, the early schools, amongst them the early school of Medina, Imam Malik school, even Imam Abu Hanifa, amongst other scholars, saw a distinction between Hadith wa Sunnah, and it's only over time that these distinctions have blurred, and then until to, you know, like some schools saw them as synonyms, like the Shafi'is and others, that today that's become like the norm. Like people say, well, you know, it's in the Hadith, therefore, ergo, it's Sunnah.
Yeah. I mean, this can be the concept of Sunnah can be approached from many different angles, like linguistically, conceptually, like its relationship with the Quran and the Hadith, hermeneutically. But the first point that I think we should always keep in mind is that this concept of Sunnah, like any other concept, has evolved over time. All right, and that linguistically, when we look at the concept from an etymological linguistic perspective, we see that it was used in a number of different contexts. You know, what the Sunnah meant in pre-Quranic Arabia was different from how the Quran uses the concept, how the concept was used in, let's say, the 1st century or 2nd century of Islam, and then 3rd century, and so on and so forth. And like during the formative period of Islam, Sunnah was not its meaning was not fixed, actually. I mean, the Professor Zafar Ansari, I think he's also a Pakistani scholar, he wrote an excellent paper back in 1972 on Islamic juristic terminology prior to Shafi'i.
Oh, right, okay. I have one. Yeah. I think it may be his, actually. But this one, the one I have, is more centered. He looks at the Muwatta, but the concept of Sunnah and how its origin. Yeah.
Yeah, and even what the conservative scholar from Saudi Arabia who has written on this, Azami, I think.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, he says that, like, in formative period of Islam, the way the concept of Sunnah was used by same scholar in different works could be different. It could have a different meaning. So there is like in terms of usage, the concept of Sunnah was used differently by different people. And so that's the first point that we need to make. And then, so there was a comparative lack of fixity in meaning, and it was used in different contexts. Yeah, so that's the first point. And then there is a difference between the way the concept of Sunnah was used, let's say Islamic jurisprudence later on, and the way it's used in, in Arabic lexica or in, so so it's a very the concept of Sunnah has so many meanings depending upon the context in which you use the word. Yeah. But also, so that's one element.
Okay.
But even if we restrict its meaning to how it's used, let's say in Islamic jurisprudence, in the formative period of Islam, for example, Sunnah was not necessarily always associated with the persona of the Prophet himself. So you have the Sunnah of the caliphs, the Sunnatul Muslimin, the Sunnah of all the Muslim community, the Sunnah of especially the community of Medina, as you have repeatedly stated. So you have this idea of the Sunnah, the well-known Sunnah, the well-preserved Sunnah, Sunnah al-Ma'rufa, al-Mahfuza. So the sources of Sunnah in formative period of Islam were not restricted to the Prophet himself, alayhi salam, but other people could also institute new Sunnah or embody and perpetuate that concept. Yeah. Moreover, if you look at the works of Western scholars on the concepts of Sunnah, for example, Shachtan, Jumboil, Khalaq, and many others, they've said that the concept of Sunnah, for example, was constitutive and inclusive of reason itself. So later on, of course, Sunnah and reason, due to the influence of Ahl al-Hadith and those kinds of people, they have kind of tried to monopolize the concept of Sunnah and said the Sunnah has nothing to do with reason, it's a textualist-based thing. Whereas in formative period of Islam, something that was constitutive of reason was actually co-constitutive of Sunnah. And I have lots of references. I have written a very lengthy journal article published in Arab Law Quarterly back in 2011 or so that summarizes especially the Western scholarship on this question. So it's important to understand that the idea that the Sunnatun Nabi is a very secondary, it's a very historically speaking, a secondary development in Islamic history that came around as a result of the efforts of the Muhaddithun in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So when people talk about the concept of Sunnah and mainstream Sunni Islam, they actually referring to a concept of Sunnah that only became more prevalent in the 3rd and 4th centuries of Islamic calendar. It's not necessarily faithful to the concept of Sunnah the way it was understood in the first half of the 2nd century.
No, that is a very profound point, Professor.
Yeah. So and like also certain questions pertaining what is the scope, what is the normative scope of the concept of Sunnah? Does Sunnah tell us something about Aqidah, or is it just about akhlaq, and is it just about fiqh, or is it just about amal? So I argued, like yourself in my article in 2007, that Sunnah cannot introduce elements pertaining to Aqidah. Or our Aqidah must be cannot be based upon Hadith. Sunnah as a form of Hadith. Yeah, so that's why I rejected the second coming of Jesus on the basis of the fact that you cannot introduce Islamic Arkanul Islam Iman on the basis of a Hadith. It must be.
And it's fascinating that even just as a side tangential note, there were many ulama who, as amongst them, for example, the Baghdadiyin or many of the Iraqin of the Malikiya and other people, who said that the ahadith, the ahadith cannot make something haram or cannot make something wajib. As in fard, that any commandment that comes through hadith can at most be recommended. Or so if there was a do that we get from the Quran, it can mean an obligation. But if there was a do from the hadith, it can only reach the level of it's recommended to do it, as in it's a good thing, do it. And if there's a don't, it can only reach the level of karaha, like it's discouraged, but not haram. This is in just do's and don'ts, let alone beliefs. Beliefs are like, so much more, like they would be on another level, but that's just a tangential note. But yeah,
exactly. Yeah, that's very pertinent. So, we need to really, when we talk about the concept of Sunnah, then we need to be clear as to what is its nature and what is its scope, what is its kind of territory, what can it tell us, what are the boundaries of its of the way it operates, and what it can in terms of a source of Islamic law. Yeah. So and as a source of Islamic teachings in general. Yeah. So I would argue that the concept of Sunnah, regardless if it's hadith based or independent of hadith, it cannot and should not include religious beliefs that are part of kind of basic belief systems of Muslims. Yeah. So we have, the concept of Sunnah evolved significantly over time, and this is something that mainstream discourses on Sunnah and traditionalist Islam brush aside and don't want and do not really grapple with it, and there are huge implications in terms of how you go about evaluating the hadith, based upon how you approach the concept of Sunnah itself.
Because even this term, term Sunnah, which now represents, for example, the mainstream body of Muslims or orthodoxy. As-Sunnah, Ahl-Sunnah, the people of the Sunnah. I mean, this term doesn't even truly really emerge until what we're looking about, almost the 3rd century or 4th century of Islam. This term kind of like emerges and kind of like starts to preponderate. But for the first 100 years, second almost 100 years of Islam, these Muslims never even referred to themselves, like they didn't have a name to refer to themselves by. It's fascinating, when you just think about that. It's like, whoa.
Yeah. Yes, and it's always inevitably, these certain groups try to monopolize certain concepts. I mean, the same thing happens in relation to, like, even the concept of bid'ah, that has been used as an antonym of Sunnah.
Yeah.
If you look at, that's also a secondary development. Like I read last year a PhD thesis on the evolution of the concept of bid'ah.
See, Professor, this is why you see people. Whilst you're just reading tabloids and I don't social media, Professor is reading PhD theses. This is why he's doing it. You're doing it, Professor. MashaAllah.
So we have to be, basically what I'm trying to say is that often people can hide behind certain concepts and they can appropriate them, but we need to be critical of the way in which they appropriate and use these concepts, because often they do not do justice to the complexities that we find in what these concepts represents, the multidimensional nature of this concept, how it evolved, how the changing shifted, how it can mean a different thing in a different context. So if there's one message that I would like to convey to our listenership is to always be very critical of any kind of concepts and ideas that are presented to us, and in overly simplistic kind of ways, because they hide more than what they tell us.
You see, but the thing is, Professor, that the simplicity of these things is not the simplicity, but the simplistic nature is a better way of saying it, of some of these slogans is what makes them sell.
Yeah. At times, perhaps they can be justified, but nonetheless, there needs to be a platform where people who engage and engage in these discussions, as you say, do a disclosure with a big D. Because what happens, as Professor Khalid Abul Fadl has said, there is an authoritative approach to knowledge and an authoritarian approach to knowledge. An authoritative approach to knowledge recognizes the complexities, situates all the opinions and, explains all the positions and situates one's own vantage point and perspective within that spectrum. So that's an authoritative approach. Authoritarian is not premised upon this kind of heuristic. It does not acknowledge the wide spectrum of interpretations. It's not a disclosure with a big D, as you say. One thing that I wanted to ask you, from a more classically informed perspective, is this concept of origin of isnads. When did they start to be systematically used as a means of authenticating hadith? I mean, I have lost touch with this kind of scholarship maybe 5-10 years ago, but the best that I know is, and this is primarily on Western scholarship, basically it says that the more systematic, the earliest time that we could situate the usage of isnad for the purposes of verifying and authenticating hadith is the 3rd quarter of the 1st century of Hijri. So around the year 75.
Right, yeah.
So I think by that time, the vast majority of companions, and even if we use the Sunni expensive understanding of who companion is, all of them would have died. So there is this. So this is a fatal flaw in a sense. I mean, how can you verify if the isnad only started to be systematically employed at the earliest, in the third quarter of the first century of Islam, when the majority of the companions had already died, then how can you have a proof, like a entirely kind of robust, how can you have so much confidence in this system, despite all the different problems that the ulum al-hadith suffers from, based on even the mainstream approaches, based on jarh and ta'dil?
I actually feel that that's if and I'm being fair here. I am part of the Sunni tradition. I am, involved with hadith studies myself. I have asanid and chains going back, and have devoted years of my life to their studies and still discuss hadith analysis. I would actually feel that that is actually a very generous kind of a take, really, to say that isnad is, it's unless it's meant that some faint origin, but to say that it's kind of roots had taken place within the first century of Islam, and that too by the third quarter. So we're talking like really the time of people like, let's say, I don't know, Abdul Malik ibn, no, sorry, before Abdul Malik ibn, maybe Yazid, and then going into Marwan, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. I honestly feel that that's very generous. Reason why, and I'm trying to be transparent here, because look, this is our own tradition. And if we are transparent with it, then we're taking the bull by the horns. People can't come and attack us because we are being open. And we're saying, yes, we know these are the things and this is how we handle it. You see, the earliest compilation efforts of hadith take place during the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, which is really which is around 100 Hijri. So he ruled from 99 to 101. And it's not his first thing. So he's in office and he's taking care of things. And then as he goes into it, he highlights, and this is what historians highlight, that he says that there is a strong concern because so many hadith have been fabricated for and against Bani Umayyah. So he says, look, there's so many hadith that people have been fabricating to please Bani Umayyah, and so many also to kind of take digs at them and support other causes against them. So he says, I think we should collect hadith. Now, there is no mention of isnad that in these records of him saying, let's collect isnads. He instructs, commissions Abu Bakr ibn Hazm and then Ibn Shihab Zuhri, really, who's in Medina, to compile hadith. Now, what you have is this is probably the first effort, real effort, of trying to put hadith together in a book, but there's no mention that chains are being mentioned. They're just collecting, this is a hadith, this is a hadith, this is a hadith, this is a hadith. And I would feel it's maybe within a decade or two of that time that had isnad start to emerge. So you see people like Ibn Sirin saying, look, people are being asked, who do you get this hadith from now? We don't just, it's not that just who, sammu lana rijalakum. This tell us, as Imam Muslim transmits, they started to say, who did you get it from? And he passes away, I believe, these people pass away like 120 something or something like into that time of Hijri. So it's between maybe 110 Hijri to, the decades that follow that this emerges. And hence, Isnad is there. You see, even if you fast forward several decades, by Imam Malik's Muwatta, it's there, but it's still very secondary. Imam Malik sometimes won't even mention an isnad and he's not bothered. It goes to show, or he'll miss out people and it's not a big deal. It goes to show that isnad is still developing. It's not taken that strong, it's not at the forefront yet. It's because Imam Malik passes away 179 Hijri. So, and if we're looking at this beginning in let's say 20, it's still, there's 50 years and it's definitely emerged. It's definitely on the horizon, but it's still not strongly at the forefront, because Imam Malik will sometimes say, Balagani, it's reached me. He will miss out the entire sanad. But then by the end of that century, And moving into the next century with this second wave of muhaddithin, the likes of Imam Ahmad, the likes of really Imam Bukhari and all of these people around him, and in that era, the Raziyan and many others, here Isnad is now at the forefront. People are very, we want to, is this person, let's criticize who are the Rijal. But it's interesting, and I've mentioned this before, that they still, yes, it gets logged, and then in the centuries later, it's going to get more, it's going to get scaffolded further, and then in Ibn Salah and Ibn Hajar's time, it gets really crystallized, this science of hadith. However, I've said that, look, if we're going to be transparent, Professor, we have to be honest. When people say, like, look, Imam, there's a narrator and he is trustworthy, and we say, okay, how do we know he's trustworthy? Well, people say, well, let's say, for example, they say, well, Abu Dawud said he's fine, or Yahya ibn Ma'in said he's fine, but this narrator passed away in, let's say, the early 2nd century, like 110, 120, 100. These scholars who vouch for him don't appear till about 120 years later. They're obviously getting this from someone. So Yahya ibn Ma'in is obviously being told via someone who also most likely didn't meet that person, who's getting it from someone else. But this substrata of data is not being conveyed to us. We don't know when Ibn Ma'in is saying, oh, look, I know A'mash is trustworthy, or he's like this. Who did you get it from? Because you never met him, and neither did your teachers meet him. So that is completely missing from the discourse. And people say, well, just blindly. And I'm not calling to dismiss Isnad or Hadith. I'm not. But I'm saying that, look, let's be real. This does you have to give some margin here of saying, well, okay, there has to be some, like a pinch of salt here. There has to be some margin of error, because these people that are vouching didn't see those people.
Yeah, especially if people are so keen to justify certain beliefs and practices on the basis of these kinds of information, and that can have huge implications on in terms of the way the society is structured, the way legal system functions. It just strikes me that the people could have so much confidence in this knowledge, yet be aware of so many potential vulnerabilities and discrepancies and problems that are part of the system itself.
And I feel that, you see, part of that is that because they fear that the whole enterprise might be swept away, and because there's layers to what they're not disclosing. So at a lighter level, there's the layers that they all disagree upon the ruwat. So that, there's hardly, there may be some, but most ruwat narrators, there's never an agreement by the dons of hadith about him. People, several may have said he's okay, and other great people like Nasa'i might say, there's several people in Sahih Bukhari that Imam Nasa'i would say, no, he's utterly unacceptable, or he's a liar, or he's da'if, or other scholars, but this person may have said it, and he won the culture vote. His book kind of gained currency over time. It didn't necessarily make it more true, it just made it more popular. That's so there's that layer. But then there's a deeper layer, like what I highlighted, that how did they even know about the people they never met? Because there isn't transparency how you acquired that knowledge about that person who was from 100 years before you even lived.
And the tabaqat literature on the Rijal itself is even later, maybe 5th century Hijri, if I'm not mistaken, the compilation of the so that's also problematic.
And I feel that they fear that, look, if you start showing the holes, or if you start showing the flies in the ointment, people are going to chuck the entire thing away. But I feel I feel that, look, let's be honest, that the Hadith project as a project is a testimony of great and outstanding human endeavor. It is. You can't knock the hard work and the outstanding kind of effort that has gone into this. With a capital letter, this great project, the Hadith project, and I feel that as far as the effort is concerned, it deserves to be saluted. That in no other tradition have people worked so hard to preserve something. And I feel that if we're transparent, we can not only own it with pride, but we can be real, and people won't have to be deadlocked and strong-armed into accepting things because when you do come across an absurd narration and people say, well, and they say, oh, but if you this is on the same level with the Quran, and if you don't accept this, you might as well just be a kafir. And then I feel what it does is it compromises the entire faith based on the risk of jeopardizing a project.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I also myself am not a Hadith rejecter, denier in that sense. I actually think that if approached from a proper kind of heuristic, a proper interpretational methodology, then they can be useful, but they need to be also contextualized. The scope needs to function only within, outside of the realm of religious beliefs and any kind of religious practices that are considered to be core of Islamic theology, as such.
And somebody had asked that. I think that's what they were trying to say in the question. That look, but don't you ultimately just fall victim to trusting then the scholars and the imams and the interpreters and I mean, I'll just give a brief response. I'd love your take on it as well. That you see, I feel that. Yes, there would always be in any field where one lacks expertise and knowledge, a sense of reliance on other people who have some expertise and knowledge. That is inevitable in any walk of life. However, I would always say that you have your reason. And if you come across something which, just seems abhorrent or seems wrong, but somehow it's been rubber stamped with religion, I would say that which ironically is from the Sunnah teachings as well, that whatever disturbs you, then no. The Hadith says, wal ithmu ma hak, and the ithm is what your heart cannot find peace with. The crime or the wrongdoing in the Hadith, it says, is that which your heart can't find tranquility with. And an example of that is the Hadith in Bukhari as well, which is interesting, and that you see there was a group of people that the Prophet had sent somewhere, and then they come up with amongst themselves, they have a leader, and one of them, they have some disputes, and he says, okay, what we're going to do to settle this dispute is we're going to have a fire, because they had some kind of fire, and you got to jump into the fire, and we're going to see who gets burnt and whatever. And the guy says that's stupid. The guy, even though you see, one of their last instructions from the Prophet when they left Medina was to obey the commander, to obey the Amir. But when the Amir tells them that, one of the people says, that's dumb. He says, I ain't going to do it. I don't care if you're the Amir. And when they go back to the Prophet says, good. You didn't obey him. Even though the final instructions were to obey him. But yet, you see, they had the voice of reason, and they're like, well, that sounds dumb. I'm not going to jump into fire, But I'd like your input on that, Professor. People that say, well, aren't you ultimately reliant then on just imams and muftis and scholars? And so isn't there still a blind dependency?
Yeah, I think what I said about the distinction between authoritative and authoritarian knowledge, as long as we understand that all knowledge is constructed and is not perfectly certain, that everybody operates on an epistemological level that is far from being entirely certain, and you leave scope for applying critical reason, as a filter, then that's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, Professor Khalid Abu Al-Fadl, to bring him in again,
Yeah.
when he
I would love to get. I would
uses,
love to get Professor on
Yeah.
here. You know, I know his health
Yeah.
isn't doing too well, but yeah.
He uses the concept of a conscientious pause. So if you come across something that is morally ugly in a text, then you use a conscientious pause.
I like that
and you
conscientious
say, well,
pause.
Yeah, I mean, God, yeah. But because we don't believe in a God who is irrational or sexist or that by definition that's not a God. So if your God is sexist, then I don't believe in that God. Or if your God allows for these morally abhorrent practices or irrational practices to exist, then that contravenes the very nature of God, the way we define God.
Exactly. And just to add to that, and that teaching is not from the Prophet ﷺ in my understanding, and I'm sure in your understanding, Professor, but rather it would have been interpolated and introduced by people over time. Because if you find, I cannot believe that like you said, that God, Allah, the creator of this majestic cosmos, would be sexist or would be cruel or irrational or throw a tantrum and do all these kind of I don't believe that, and I don't believe that a God who would then inspire and reveal to a prophet that prophet would be like that. So yeah.
Indeed, perhaps this could lead us to perhaps our last major kind of concept or discussion.
Yes, please.
Pertaining to the actual the how the God is conceptualized in classical theism compared to process theology. Perhaps maybe that's something that perhaps our audience might find interesting.
Sure, yeah.
I recently myself have come across I have come across process theology, process philosophy, perhaps 2 years ago, and I found that it has a lot of affinity with the way I have approached what I call progressive theory of academic theory of progressive Islam.
Sure, absolutely.
So yeah, and perhaps I would be interested to get to know your views about how process theology goes about defining God.
Yeah, because you see, from how I've understood process theology, Professor, is that it kind of rests on. This is how I've understood it. I've not how I've managed to grasp any understanding of it. Is that it speaks of experiences or what kind of make up the fundamental kind of blocks, if you like, at a granular level, and that God is very much part of the process. He's kind of very much part of it's a very kind of transactional kind of give and take, if that's a better word, relationship between God and creation and interdependency. I have seen it by some Christian polemics, them speaking of it. Even though I understand certain aspects and I agree with certain thoughts, like God does not do evil to people, and God does not. I understand and agree with all of that. Although I've not understood how the interdependency element would brings value to the Islamic discourse. I've not understood that. I mean so I'd love your take on it, because my understanding of process theology is very is restricted.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned already important conceptual tools, concepts there, which is fantastic. I myself am still learning about process theology. Process theology is basically a subset of process philosophy. It's a kind of an entire metaphysics. That goes back to the writings of Alfred North Whitehead, who was a mathematician and philosopher. He was originally from the UK, but then he moved to Harvard later on towards the end of his career. But yeah, kind of the main metaphysical ideas that constitute process philosophy are based upon this understanding of reality as being dynamic in process, that there is that God himself is also in process. and is constantly interacting with the creation. So perhaps the first thing that I should mention is this idea of panentheism. The idea that God, the God is part of the world, but is always more than the world. But everything unfolds. So all life, God is life in which all life unfolds, or God is love in which all love unfolds. God actually, in process theology, God has two dimensions. God has a primordial nature, which is a non-changing aspect of God.
Okay.
God's character, there's an unchanging element in God's character. So, and that is it's referred to as primordial nature of God. But God also has a consequence.
I was going to say, or somehow like almost what some theologians call pre-eternal, the kind of qadim kind of aspect. Yeah.
Exactly. So beyond time and space, I guess.
Yeah.
But God also has a consequent nature, an element in which God responds to and reacts to the creation. Yeah.
And up to that point, I mean, it seems because even in the Quran you have it speaks is it kulla yawmin fi sha'n, and he is every day involved in an affair. And classically that part, even as scholars understood that that God is involved in all current affairs.
So also process theology has a different understanding of God. So everything is relational. So even God is relational in that sense. Well, the consequent element of Godhead, if you like, is relational. But also the way the concept of God's perfection is it's conceptualized not as something that is, can unilaterally and supernaturally intervene in the world. That God also, and I think this is in harmony with some of the things that you were talking about with respect to miracles in the Quran, where you denied that God can supernaturally intervene and suspend laws of nature. All of that is in congruence with process theology, where God is the prime exemplification of the metaphysical principles that underpin reality. So God cannot break his own or her own laws of nature, because God is an exemplification and embodiment of these laws.
See, because I was kind of saying it from the angle that, you see, when God set creation into motion, and with it comes certain laws, and whether it's the laws of physics or other things are set into motion, then as God, I suppose it comes back to that other discussion. What do people mean by sunnah? But the Quran saying وَلَن تَجِدَ لِلسُّنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا. I obviously understand this as all part of God's sunnah. Then what he has set into motion, and then he has told you to observe them. Because Allah says in the Quran, look, go around, observe, look at this. Or you want to understand how creation began? Allah says in the Quran that فَصِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَانْظُرُوا. Like, why don't you look around you, observe? You're going to learn from the world around you. You can pick up principles and laws, and if the thing around us was volatile, in the sense it didn't have a pattern, it didn't have no patternicity to it, but rather it was just erratic and just did ad hoc things, then that would defy the very commandment of God that why don't you learn from nature around you? Because, well, nature then doesn't have to behave that way. Tomorrow it could just be different, and then it could just be different. And so I was kind of coming at it from that angle, that God doesn't do it, as opposed to an incapacity, as opposed to saying he's incapable, but that he wouldn't do it. I suppose it was more philosophical, the discussion. But yeah, sorry.
You see, process theology believes that God's power is kind of open source, if you like, because God's perfection is not conceptualized as in like being able to unilaterally impose himself on the creation, but actually God is the most moved mover rather than immovable mover. God has the most power, but not all the power. And God is affected and affects others. And that's where God's power resides, in the ability to influence others, but also God has the highest capacity to be influenced by others.
See, now that you say this, I recall this, yes, when I was reading up on process theology. You see, but what I was, as a question, which I'd like to put to you, Professor, what do you think that could bring to, you see, because that kind of a view it's seen as kind of diminishing some the whether aspects of power or capacity of God. What do you think that kind of a view could bring to Islam? Because wouldn't that just be kind of detracting from the concept that Islam has of God? Would you?
I think, what it brings is, first of all, it emphasizes the immanent nature, rather than the transcendental nature of God. Okay. The transcendental nature of God is still there, but it emphasizes this worldly nature of God, so that we take comfort in the fact that God is responsive to our joys, our sorrows, that God is affected and kind of sympathizes with us, and wants to bring about healing and compassion, because God has what in process theology they say an initial aim. God has an initial aim, which is to bring about a world that brings about beauty, harmony, intensity of experience, and value. So if we had a God that is beyond space and time, that is utterly transcendent, that has this kind of immediate glance of the past, present, and the future, and knows the future in a predetermined sense, then it takes away from the immanence of God. So in process theology, God is a source of all potentialities, but it doesn't bring about every actuality. It needs input from the creation. So God, although God is all knowledgeable, but God doesn't have a knowledge of future, because there is no knowledge to be known. Okay, once the knowledge is there, then God has complete knowledge of the knowledge that already exists. But because the future is open, and because the creatures and humanity in particular has agency and plays a part in determining the future, given its context and situation in which every person finds themselves in, then God does not have a unilateral monopoly on power. And I think this reconciles, this kind of has affinity with the idea of human beings being the khalifas on earth. So it gives space. It reconciles, I think, from my perspective, it gives due credit to human agency without taking away from God.
You see, because I kind of you see, a lot of those premises being posited that you were saying along the way, I agree with those things, like you were saying about, like, God is about creating value, he's about compassion, he's about kind of loving loving things, being, that whole the whole description. I am all with that, and I do teach that, except the difference being that I personally don't feel the need to say, well, God is not all powerful, or he's not all, because I feel that there are different, like you said, different aspects or different perspectives on when we see God. There is the transcendental, understanding, which you mentioned, like which is when we're discussing ontologically or something about God as in the transcendent.
Yeah.
But then in our experiences, he is the immanent. He is here. He is something that, that blesses us, that, or that, loves us, or that intervenes in his own way. But he doesn't, because he sets out laws of nature, of the forces. He does not change them, as he has already stated. I mean, so this is why I felt that, you see, a lot of these things we already believe them, but I just didn't see the need in saying things like, well, God is not then all powerful, or he does not necessarily know, or he doesn't, because I felt that kind of detracted from the
Yeah.
understanding of God.
Yeah, the problem is that one of the main reasons why it's important to understand God's power as being relational rather than unilateral is because it helps us deal with this question of theodicy and the presence of evil.
Yeah.
Why didn't God intervene in the Holocaust, in the Bosnian War, in all these wars? Because if God is all powerful, then God is basically, the conclusion that we can come to is that God either doesn't care or God is evil or permits evil. But if we say that God lures us and attracts us to goodness and wholeness, but it cannot coerce us and doesn't have unilateral power to prevent evil from happening because of the way God chose to create a world in which God limited himself.
But could it not also be, Professor, that God does those things, because I would answer, and obviously the concept of theodicy is, the question of theodicy is a very difficult one throughout the ages for all theologians, but I would say that it's not that God, because, the dichotomy that either God can do it, but he doesn't, so either he doesn't care or either he is doing it. I would say that neither of them, that God has given agency to humans, and by divinely intervening at each point, it would take away the agency and the responsibility from human beings. So even though the result is the same, that you're saying that God has given agency, but I'm saying he's doing this by will, not by incapacity, not by the fact that he can't, but that he's doing it by will, that he has given human agency and responsibility to human beings on earth to be responsible for their actions. I think that would be the kind of the demarcating, the distinction. But I feel, that's very interesting. But I mean, I definitely in the past, when I did look at process theology, what was it about? I couldn't get a good grasp of. I was trying to understand, and I was thinking maybe I'm misunderstanding what they're saying, and.
Yeah, it is a very complex metaphysic, and it's not easy to understand. So I didn't actually do justice to it, but to me, it does make sense, and I think that this idea that God's power should be seen as something in relational terms rather than unilateral terms, it's very attractive to me, and the idea that being God means it's about capacity to influence and experience the feelings of others rather than to have the power to determine events, kind of. So that like a soft power, I guess, rather than
a kind
the
of
hard power.
I would kind of I would kind of reconcile what I've said in the past. People say that, because I've often said that I feel that the core at the message of the Prophet ﷺ was, or the core message really, or what was at the heart of it, was to bridge between the transcendent and the immanent, the kind of personal God. And I've said that, and that has been a difficult journey. It's been a difficult journey for humanity. But what I would often say there that kind of helps bridge that, and I suppose it's almost like a negation of saying something, but it's that laysa kamithlihi shay, that Allah says that, look, it's because there's no parallels to it, you won't be able to truly grasp it, because we only grasp based on parallels. We say, well, this, and then God is like that. So yeah, that's how I
There is
kind of
always an
answer it.
element of speculation, you know, and process theology very much takes that seriously into account. But I think it is so important to move away from this classical theistic view of God as, you know, a patriarch who is all powerful and can determine everything, and you are just supposed to be a puppet following in the, you know.
Yeah, no, I agree. That I feel is that kind of old anthropomorphic benevolent tyrant, that kind of benevolent dictator view is very, I feel it's it's like when I've ever spoken on that, I quote the verse of the Quran that وَمَا قَدْرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ, that, you know, they did not truly estimate God, that they underestimated him. And
and the ideas that we find, like the idea of God being a beloved that we find in Islamic mysticism, really, I think there's a lot of affinity between this emphasis in process theology on God being this creative, responsive love
that is interesting.
That works with every individual where they are at situationally, and being ever responsive in a creating, loving way. I think that's this concept of a beloved that we find in Rumi and Ibn Arabi.
Because
really
the mystics, the mystics in Islam, they definitely have this kind of very intimately personal relationship with God. It's a very intimate and exclusive, almost like an insider relationship that is strange to the outsider. They can't even relate to this, and often the mystics not even referring to God by God, but as, like you said, as the beloved, or as whether you want to say it, or, you know, because people would say he, but it, huwa, in Arabic is not necessarily he, but that they used terms and often didn't even use the word God. It's interesting, this whole legacy of the mystics within Islam, how they managed to carve a very still, even though it was seen as, you know, odd, but a very powerful identity that left an indelible mark on our tradition of Islam.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to human psychology, I think, because we like the comfort of knowing that there is someone who can understand us completely as who we are, and understand our concerns, sorrows, joys, you know, because to be honest with you, you know, despite what they say about romantic love, we all know, those of us who are married, romantic love only goes to a certain level. You know, you can never be perfectly understood.
Then Professor, marry again?
No, because
I'm joking.
God's love operates at a, you know, deeper level.
I do feel it's interesting that as humans we forever are in search of that. Almost
the inner child, that, you know, the inner child who can
that
understand
affection
us perfectly.
That inner child seeking that unfound yet intimately familiar love and affection.
Oh, that's beautifully put. And I think the God of process theology that we also find in Islamic mysticism, as I would argue, in some forms of Islamic mysticism, really satisfies that need, and it conceptualizes God in like as that ever responsive kind of companion, kind of the best parent, best friend you can ever have.
Well, Professor, shukran ever so much. I've really enjoyed having this dialogue. I've really, you know, you're amazing and very highly informative company. Well, I can clearly see why you're the senior lecturer where you are, Professor. So, hayyak Allah. I'm deeply grateful for you, for giving your time today.
Actually, I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The erudite, the most erudite person, you are much more erudite than me, I am so happy to have been able to benefit from your knowledge. I continue to hope to benefit from your knowledge, and I hope more and more people will recognize the kind of the critical kind of I'm trying to use my language carefully. The kind of the preciousness, I would even call it the preciousness, the precious input and the critical input that you bring into many of these debates pertaining to religion, Islam in particular. You are an indispensable, highly important and critical voice, and please continue what you are doing, and may Allah preserve you, give you good health, excellent health, to continue what you're doing in the future. And I really hope that more people will discover you and listen to your wisdom and subscribe to your channels.
Wow, Professor. Wallahi, there's so much love, man. Honestly, shukran. You're gonna bring tears to my eyes, Professor. So,
well deserved. Thank you again for extending
Professor,
this opportunity.
Before we sign off, if people want to reach out to you or connect with you, what are the best platforms to do so?
I have become increasingly social media shy.
Okay.
If they are interested, I have a few YouTube videos on gender egalitarian interpretations of Islam and concept of Salafism, but I'm not a very articulate person. I prefer the written word. So I have my academia.edu. I have my profile there. Many of my publications are available on my academia.edu.
Are they also available on Amazon?
Oh, well, yes, but I don't want people to spend money, so don't do that. Yeah, just go to obviously some of the stuff.
Look at the love, yeah. Look at Abe Siko, yeah. Learn from the professor. Yeah. This is love and affection. Allahu Akbar. But shukran once again, and people, Hayakumullah, as always. I deeply appreciate you guys taking out these vampire hours to tune in with us. Obviously, Professor is in Australia. It's a very good morning over there, and for many of us here, it's good night. So, Professor, first of all, to you once again, shukran wa barakallahu feek, and to you as well, people. I'm gonna sign out. I'll put up my page, so if you haven't already liked and shared. Now, obviously, Professor's here, so I'm not going to use my normal foul language. So, people, you can tune in, and shukran, and speak soon. Ma'as-salama, people. Ma'as-salama, Professor.
Fi amanillah.